Hello, this is Nikita Belausov, and today I'm going to present Iraq War. No face going on this time, but it's not all about the face, now is it? As someone who was born in 1993, I wasn't conscious enough to remember or understand the Yugoslav wars, or, a bit surprisingly, any of the Chechen wars. However, there is a moment that stands in my memory clear as day, and that is September 11th of the year 2001. They cancelled all the cartoons that day and constantly showed the footage of aeroplanes crashing into the World Trade Center. That was really scary. And then, sometime after that, I remember Grandpa grumbling about the news of American forces invading Iraq, and a map on a TV screen with bright arrows showing where exactly those forces were heading, from the southernmost part to Baghdad, that is, in the center. It is hard to recall over how many days or weeks exactly that invasion took place, but it must have been quite a bit before that statue of Saddam Hussein was demolished. That's pretty much the last thing I remember about that war, until a piece of news came that Hussein himself was captured and then executed. My grandparents, along with various TV reporters, were pretty sure about the reasoning behind that war. The United States wanted to have access to lots of oil that Iraq possessed. Now that more than a decade had passed, I've tried to investigate the issue a bit deeper, but not too deep, as wars are just not a fun thing to discuss, especially for a pacifist like me. So, let's get to the background. It was quite a surprise for me to learn that the Iraq War that started in 2003 was not at all the first one. There were two more so-called Persian Gulf Wars, one that took place from 1990 to 1991, and the other one that happened over most of the 1980s, and is better known as Iran-Iraq War. It looks like the presidency of Saddam Hussein that started in 1979 was not by any means peaceful. Another surprising fact to me was that in the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq was not only supported by Soviet Union, but also, and even more, by the United States and NATO. Apparently, the Islamic Revolution that happened in Iran a year before the war started was a bigger concern for the world than possible big ambitions Hussein had. So, for nearly 80 years, Iran and Iraq fought each other without much progress from either side. More than 100,000 civilians were killed in the process. Poison gas weapons were heavily used, and only in 1988 both countries accepted the ceasefire resolution without any border changes. Just a few years after that, Iraq had claimed the rights for the territory of Kuwait, along with a few other accusations, and soon after invaded the much smaller country. Kuwaiti army was not ready for this, so it only took 2 days for Iraq to complete the invasion and annex Kuwait. Doesn't that remind you of anything? And again, both of the superpowers agreed in their disapproval for that action. However, while the United States wanted to use their army to free Kuwait, USSR criticized that decision. Anyhow, after 7 months of occupation, the coalition forces that mostly consisted of United States troops entered Kuwait and made Iraqi troops retreat, following them into Iraq for quite a bit before withdrawing. That was the end of the Gulf War, also known as the First Televised War. As it usually happens, after losing, Iraq got severely punished with sanctions. Any weapons of mass destruction had to be destroyed under United States control. The country had to pay reparations to Kuwait, which actually continue up to this very day, and both export and import were greatly limited. No-fly zones were also enforced over both northern and southern parts of Iraq. The sanctions are considered successful. However, common Iraqi people suffered much more than they should have. There wasn't enough food, clean water, or medical supplies, and a rough estimate is that 500,000 children under 5 years old had died because of these poor conditions. Still, Hussein's government held strong, even though some rightfully say the goal of the sanctions was for a revolution overthrowing him to take place. And that's how we finally come to the 2003 invasion. Even though the United Nations inspectors saw some of the weaponry destroyed, there was also some evidence of new biological weapons research and production. The United States declared that Iraq was not going to disarm itself and that it was unacceptable, withdrawing its inspectors for a few years before the final warning in 2002, which Iraq accepted. Even though the inspectors didn't find any evidence for mass destruction weapon production this time, the United States argued that Hussein was in fact doing just that. They also claimed that Hussein had links with Al-Qaeda, an Islamic terrorist group notorious for the September 11th attacks, and that Iraq was a threat to the whole world. Even though many of those claims turned out to be fabricated by the Bush government, and even though many people throughout the world were opposed to the war, the invasion sadly did happen. As in the Gulf War, the majority of the troops were from the United States, with some help from United Kingdom, Australia, and Poland. It didn't take long for the combined forces to take over Baghdad, and the end of major combat operations was declared in May, just 1.5 months after the operation began. Of course, the Iraq War doesn't only consist of the invasion phase. Otherwise, American troops wouldn't have stayed there for 8 more years. The insurgency movement started right after the invasion, and it is currently stronger than ever, especially after the troops left the country. At first, the insurgents only targeted the coalition forces, but then Iraqi security forces were under attack as well for cooperating with the enemy. Some of the rebels wanted Hussein's party back in power, while some fought over the land, as there are several different factions and ethnic groups living in Iraq, such as the Kurds or Sunni and Shia Islamists. It might be right to say that ever since 2003, Iraq continues to endure civil war. The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, better known as ISIL, regularly makes the news for their aggressive behavior. One might ask, why did the US withdraw from Iraq? And the answer would probably be that the American public didn't want to see itself in the war much longer. Thousands of people who were deployed to Iraq are left with post-traumatic stress disorder, which reminds of the Vietnam War generation. Some say that the United States left Iraq too soon, but perhaps they shouldn't have gone there in the first place. Now it's really hard to say when the country can enjoy living in full peace again. That concludes my presentation on the Iraq War. I'm sure I have missed many details, but if you're interested, it is easy to look them up on the internet. So, thank you for listening, and goodbye.